What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, I hope you enjoyed today's episode and continue to tune in to future episodes. Today's episode is all about sodium bicarbonate and how it can be used to, or I should say, what the research says about how it could be used to improve performance. So most of you will know sodium bicarbonate as baking soda, or maybe if you don't know that, then know that baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. And so if you've ever heard of an athlete using baking soda to improve their performance, it's because of the sodium bicarbonate. Now, you can get sodium bicarbonate through more than just baking soda. We'll be talking about some of the different ways that athletes can get in sodium bicarbonate to their system. But baking soda is one of them. But obviously, there's supplements that are made as well that contain sodium bicarbonate. And then at the very end, we'll be talking about some of the more recent developments in a newer method to get sodium bicarbonate into your system, which is through like a lotion or a cream. So we'll talk about what some of the research says about ingesting it first, so like taking it in through baking soda or like a tablet in the form of a supplement. And then at the very end, there's much less research surrounding the use of a cream or a lotion, but we will talk about a little bit of that research as well. So baking soda, most commonly used in baking goods or baked goods, right? But since about the 1930s, it's been studied for its performance-enhancing effects. And in order to understand why you would ingest sodium bicarbonate to enhance your performance, we need to understand a little bit about how fatigue occurs in the body. So fatigue occurs by a variety of different mechanisms, but one of the ways in which fatigue can occur is by an increase in the blood pH within your body, or an increase in the acidity of the environment within your muscle tissue or within the blood. And so typically how that happens is during exercise. Some of the byproducts of exercise include carbon dioxide, which is one way that the acidity of the environment inside of the muscle can become more acidic, but also the increase in hydrogen ions that happens, particularly when exercise becomes more and more intense. And we're going to focus a little bit more on what happens with those hydrogen ions right now. So let's say you're going out and you're going for an easy run, and you start to gradually ramp up the intensity or your pace. What's going to happen is you start to increase the pace or the intensity is the amount of hydrogen ions that are in your system is going to go higher and higher. You're going to start producing more and more hydrogen ions. Now, typically what happens with hydrogen ions when you're in a very aerobic state, or when you're at a very, very easy exercise intensity, is they can be picked up by oxygen and used, and essentially it creates water, or they're picked up by other molecules that are involved in energy producing pathways, and they can actually be used to help fuel the production of ATP, or energy within the body. But when you start producing so much of them that the body can't keep up with it, it has to pick up those hydrogen ions that are floating around, or else your internal environment will start to become too acidic, and that increase in acidity can lead to fatigue. So one of the ways that it does this is with lactate. So what normally happens is when you produce lactate, that hydrogen ion is actually picked up by another molecule that's in the body, and that forms lactate. So that's one of the ways in which you can neutralize that hydrogen ion. Another way you can neutralize it is through bicarbonate, which happens to be present in the body as well. So you have a bicarbonate buffering system in your body, and essentially what happens is you have the bicarbonate molecule, which is a hydrogen atom or ion, and then CO3. So HCO3 is what makes up bicarbonate, if you remember back to maybe your chemistry days in high school or college. And then a hydrogen ion is a positively charged hydrogen atom, right? So it's H+, whereas bicarbonate is a negative molecule, it's HCO3, and so it can actually pick up that hydrogen ion and turn into carbonic acid in the body, which is H2CO3. Now, what happens to the H2CO3, one of the things that can happen to it is it gets transported to the lungs, and it breaks down into water and carbon dioxide, and then you exhale the carbon dioxide. So one of the ways in which you help to maintain a stable internal environment in terms of how acidic or basic your pH is is you essentially exhale carbon dioxide. And one of the ways that you exhale carbon dioxide, or one of the ways that you get carbon dioxide to exhale, is through bicarbonate picking up hydrogen ions. So in theory, if we were to ingest more bicarbonate, let's say in the form of sodium bicarbonate, then that should in theory allow us to buffer more hydrogen ions when we're exercising. And then you would think that that would help, particularly as you're exercising intensely and you're producing a lot of hydrogen ions. It would essentially add more buffering capacity to a system that's already in place in the body. So that's in theory how it should help delay the onset of fatigue during exercise. And so again, you can get sodium bicarbonate into the body through a variety of different ways, which would be baking soda or say a supplement. You could even like mix it in a drink and then drink it. Doesn't really matter how you get it in, but you can ingest it right through the mouth. And so luckily there's been a lot of research that's been done looking at ingesting sodium bicarbonate and what effects it has on athletic performance. And like I said, it's been around for a while, but research kind of really started to look at it in the 1930s. So obviously it's been 80 years since then, or 90 years since then. So we have a lot of research that we can look at today. And now luckily, since it's a relatively well-studied topic, we can look at, in particular, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which are essentially papers that are published that like compile a bunch of research on a specific topic, usually good quality randomized controlled trials, and they'll summarize the research that's been done either qualitatively or quantitatively by doing like actual analyses across the results that are provided by a variety of different randomized controlled trials. And so luckily we have some papers like that we can look at. So back in 2012, there was a meta-analysis that was done that was looking at this exact topic of what happens when you ingest sodium bicarbonate on athletic performance. And so this paper back in 2012 compiled a bunch of different randomized controlled trials that explored athletes, both men and women, trained and untrained individuals across a variety of different sports. And they had them ingest sodium bicarbonate in all these studies, and then they looked at essentially what effect it had on a variety of different performance measures. And so in summary, without getting into detail of every single individual study that was included within the larger meta-analysis, they concluded that there was a moderate effect of sodium bicarbonate on performance in general. So again, this is a summary of a variety of different studies with a ton of different types of individuals, both men and women, trained individuals, untrained individuals. Some of them were actual athletes, some of them were non-athletes and were maybe untrained or just trained non-athletes. And then it was across a variety of different sports and then performance measures. But in general, what the meta-analysis showed was that sodium bicarbonate tended to have a moderate effect on performance. And so this would potentially be a good thing. This would essentially mean that in general, if an athlete was to ingest sodium bicarbonate before an athletic endeavor, it would probably improve their performance. So there's enough evidence to support that it would likely have some degree of an effect on their performance, likely improving their performance. Now, a couple caveats that came out of this study. One of them was that in general, it tended to be that trained individuals were less likely to experience an effect of sodium bicarbonate on performance when compared to untrained individuals. And the thought process here, at least what these authors theorized, was that trained individuals tend to have a better acid buffering capacity through consistent training, whereas untrained individuals don't. They essentially haven't trained their body to be able to better handle an increase in acidity through intense exercise. So that was one of the potential theories that they offered up as to why this might have come out in this particular study. And then sodium bicarbonate ingestion seemed to exert a benefit across a variety of different performance measures of different durations. So on performance measures that were like, say, 2 minutes or less, this is getting into like really short kind of anaerobic or sprint capacity. It tended to have an effect. It also tended to have an effect on performance measures that were of 2 to 10 minutes in duration. So this is getting into kind of like VO2 max territory. It tended to have still a moderate effect on performance measures of that duration, as well as longer, more aerobic endurance performance measures. So 10 minutes or longer, it also tended to have an effect as well. So it had an effect on a variety of different performance measures across a range of different durations. So that means for a lot of different endurance athletes who participate in different distances and different durations of events, it could likely have an effect on your performance. Now, in order to get the benefit of this performance, it seemed that 0.2 to 0.4 grams per kilogram of body weight of sodium bicarbonate was needed roughly an hour to 2 hours before exercise in order to experience the benefits. So just like with any other like supplement or like food or product that's out there, you need to make sure that when you're taking it, you're taking enough of it so that you can actually get a benefit from it, right? So if you were to have, like caffeine is a good example. So caffeine has been very well studied, and it's known to have an ergogenic effect on performance. In other words, it improves performance, but when taken at the right dosage. So if you drink like a quarter of a cup of coffee, you're not going to get enough caffeine to really elicit a positive improvement in performance. Whereas if you were to drink like 3 or 4 cups of coffee, that's likely going to have an effect on your performance because the dose is high enough. And so the same thing is true with sodium bicarbonate. You need to make sure that you're taking enough of it so that you can actually get an effect from it. Now, 0.2 to 0.4 grams per kilogram of body weight doesn't seem like a whole lot, but it kind of is. And especially when you look at different supplements that are out there that contain sodium bicarbonate, it actually tends to be a lot of that particular supplement. Now, one of the big downfalls of sodium bicarbonate, particularly when ingesting it, so like eating it or consuming it so that it passes through the stomach, is that you can have some pretty nasty GI side effects from it. You can have a lot of like GI discomfort and bloating and kind of feelings of nausea and just, all the kind of stuff that endurance athletes usually want to avoid, because that kind of stuff can have a negative impact on your performance. Especially when you take sodium bicarbonate in at high levels or high doses, which you kind of need to take a lot of it in order to get a performance benefit. So sodium bicarbonate has always been an interesting supplement because it tends to have a positive effect on performance, but it tends not to sit well with a lot of athletes in their stomach and in their gut. And so sometimes those negatives of the GI discomfort and the GI distress can outweigh the potential positives that it has on performance. And usually the types of athletes that would be taking sodium bicarbonate are likely very well-trained athletes who are trying to take it to get that extra 1 or 2% advantage over a competitor. So usually it's athletes that are pretty well trained and they're reasonably competitive and they're trying to do well in their age group or overall in a race, or even at the professional level, they're trying to win the race. So those are usually the athletes that would probably be inclined to take sodium bicarbonate in the first place. And we know that it tends to have less of an effect on athletes that are very well trained because their internal system is already very good at buffering increases in acidity. So sodium bicarbonate ingestion might not make a lot of sense for a lot of athletes, particularly well-trained athletes, because the GI distress or discomfort might outweigh that very small advantage it might give you. But again, this is something that requires a little bit of experimentation on an individual level. So some athletes who have a really high tolerance to GI distress or GI discomfort that can get away with doing a lot of things that other athletes couldn't, they might benefit from sodium bicarbonate because if they ingest it at the recommended dosages to see an improvement, they might not see any GI distress. So it just takes a little bit of playing around with on an individual basis. Some athletes with more sensitive stomachs might not be able to do it because they might try and take it at the recommended dosage and the GI discomfort is just too much. So you kind of have to play around with it. But when it comes to supplements you have to be careful of because a lot of times with supplements, they're not necessarily driven by research or evidence that's out there, in the sense that sometimes the dosages that they recommend on the label itself isn't informed by what research suggests should be the recommended dosage to get an effect. So for example, I looked at a bunch of different supplements when I was writing this up and before making this podcast. One of them that I looked at in particular, I won't necessarily name the particular company, but I'll be sure to link into the show notes below the write-up that I did on my website on this particular topic. And then within there, I talk about the specific supplement and I give a link to the supplement on that company's website. But with this particular supplement, when you looked at the label and what the recommended serving size was, I think it was like 1 or 2 capsules. So it was a supplement that contained sodium bicarbonate in capsule format. And I think they recommended 1 or 2 capsules like 30 to 60 minutes before exercise. But when you actually looked at how much sodium bicarbonate was in each capsule, if you were to just have 1 or 2 capsules, you were falling way, 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 way short of what the research suggests is the dose that you need to see an actual benefit on your athletic performance. And so I calculated it out, and for me, myself being about 75 kilograms in body weight, I needed about 30 servings or pills, which is half of the bottle. And so if I were to buy that supplement, not knowing anything about what the research says on this topic and just trusting that they're recommending the right dose, I would be falling way, 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 way short. And I likely wouldn't be getting any physiological benefit from the sodium bicarbonate itself. And I won't go down this sidetrack too far, but the placebo effect can be very powerful. And so athletes who say get a supplement, and if they truly deeply believe that that supplement is going to help them, it very well might help them because of the placebo effect. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates that athletes who believe in something, even if there's not necessarily like an actual physiological basis for it, just the belief in the product or the device or whatever they're doing, whatever the intervention is that they're introducing to their body, if they truly and deeply believe in it, it can actually have a physiological effect. So there's something to be said about that when it comes to supplementation and other types of like performance enhancing approaches that athletes might take. But that aside, if you were to take some of the supplements that were out there, they might be recommending a dose of sodium bicarbonate that's far below what would be recommended, at least in terms of what the research suggests to elicit a benefit on athletic performance. So just be wary of that when you're looking at supplements, because most people aren't just going to like mix sodium bicarbonate with water or baking soda with water and drink that before athletic performance. Although that is one way to do it. You can just, if you can measure out how much baking soda or how much sodium bicarbonate is in the baking soda you're getting, and then make sure you get the right amount of baking soda, you could just mix it up in a drink and then drink it, and that's one way of getting it. But most athletes are going to likely resort to some kind of supplement because usually it's just easier to consume that way. Now, aside from ingesting sodium bicarbonate, there is a slightly newer way that some athletes are getting sodium bicarbonate into their system, and that would be through the development of creams and lotions that a few different companies have made that contains sodium bicarbonate within the cream or lotion itself. So one company that a lot of athletes may recognize is Alm. So for example, that lotion that company makes contains sodium bicarbonate, and they essentially tell you to like rub the cream or the lotion onto whatever muscle groups you're using the most in your activity. So if you're a runner, for example, you would rub the lotion itself on your thighs, on your calves, on your hamstrings, all the muscles that you're going to be using when you run. And that gets the sodium bicarbonate into your system transdermally or through the skin. And that avoids, so the benefit to this is that it avoids you having to ingest the sodium bicarbonate, which then helps you avoid any potential gastrointestinal effects that you might otherwise get if you're sensitive to ingesting the sodium bicarbonate. So in theory, if you could get enough sodium bicarbonate into the system without having to ingest it, that could be a good thing because you get all the benefit of the sodium bicarbonate without any of the downfalls of having to ingest it, at least on your GI system. And so these creams haven't been around for too long. I don't think I've seen them around for more than a few years. And because they haven't been around for too long, there's also not a ton of research out there that would necessarily demonstrate that they're effective for improving performance. There's actually only a few studies that have been done on these creams or lotions that contain sodium bicarbonate. And I found most of this research through the Alm website. So luckily on their website, they actually have a tab that shows the science to support some of their claims. So that's good. So normally when you're looking for when you're looking to buy a product that's claiming to improve performance, you would hope that at least that product is backed or grounded in some level of science to demonstrate that the product actually works. And so the first step is to like look on the company's website and see if they give the science that supports their product and what their product claims to do, because you'd hope that they would have some science to back it up. And so luckily they had some science on their website that backed up some of the claims that they were making. But when it comes to these creams and lotions, there's only been like a couple studies that have been done. I only found a couple papers that were published, and one of them, and I think it was actually one study that they published 2 different papers out of, and I think one of them was like an abstract that was presented at a conference, and then another one might have been a paper itself. But there's not very much research that's been done on the actual creams and the lotions. So there's a lot of research that's been done through ingesting sodium bicarbonate. But when it comes to rubbing a cream or a lotion on your skin, not quite as much research. Now, my biggest question is when critiquing or critically evaluating whether or not the creams or the lotions work is how much sodium bicarbonate actually gets into your system. So we know that with ingesting sodium bicarbonate, you need to have so much of it. And typically what the research suggests is about 0.2 to 0.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. So you would hope that if you're getting a cream or a lotion instead of ingesting it, that you would be getting that same amount of sodium bicarbonate into your system so that you can have an effect. And again, getting it in through the skin versus ingesting it is a little bit different. So it's not necessarily to say that you need to have like 0.2 to 0.4 grams of sodium bicarbonate per kilogram of body weight in the cream or lotion itself, because when you ingest it, not every single gram of that sodium bicarbonate goes into the muscle and the bloodstream itself. So you're going to lose some of it. And so the creams and the lotions is again, you're delivering it through a different mechanism. And so we have no idea like how much sodium bicarbonate needs to be in a cream or a lotion in order to see an improvement in performance. So this is where research will have to be done in order to determine like what the right dosage of sodium bicarbonate in the lotion is, so that you can actually elicit an improvement in performance. And so the only downside to these creams and lotions being so new is, again, that there's not research to support a lot of these types of things that would go into the development of the cream and the lotion. And so of the study, of that one study that's been done, it did luckily show that the cream or the lotion that contains sodium bicarbonate had positive effects on performance and recovery. And in that particular study, that included an increased buffering capacity with simultaneously lower heart rate, perceived exertion during various lengths of exercise tests that they conducted in this study, as well as reductions in muscle soreness in the days following intense exercise. And this was all compared to a control group. So we at least have a study that looked at the use of sodium bicarbonate-based lotions on exercise performance compared to a control group, and they performed exercise tests and showed that there was lower heart rate in the group that used the sodium bicarbonate cream with a lower perceived exertion. So this is good, right? And then that was compared to a control group that didn't see those same effects. And then also the reduction in muscle soreness in the days following intense exercise. That's also a good thing when compared to the control group. Now, a couple downsides to this study is that it included a relatively small sample size, which is pretty typical of some of these types of like exercise testing based studies. It's really hard to have really, really large sample sizes. And so that's where the accumulation of a bunch of different studies over time tends to give a lot more credibility or validity to a product when there's been a lot of studies done that all tend to show something similar, that it has an effect on performance. So just in light of the fact that it was just this one study with a few subjects, it's still positive though, right? So it's not negative, at least in the sense that of that one study, at least there was positive effects on performance and not no effect on performance. Now, another downside to this study is that they only looked at physiological workload measures. So in other words, perceived exertion, heart rate, blood lactate levels, those are all physiological variables, not necessarily performance variables. So like a performance variable would be, did their time improve on like a 5-kilometer running time trial? So if we saw that their perceived exertion and heart rate were lower, but and their blood lactate levels were lower, but they got, or their blood lactate levels were maybe even higher, but they got a faster time on their 5K, then that would be a good thing, because that's showing you that the cream then likely contributed to improved performance outcomes. But in this particular study, we only have physiological outcomes that they measured. So again, we don't necessarily know if it improves performance, because it's one thing to have an effect on perceived exertion and heart rate, but does that actually make someone go faster or go farther at a quicker rate? And we don't necessarily know that, because there's only that one study that then got published into 2 different papers or abstracts. So again, with the creams and the lotions, it's a little bit too early to tell per se if the lotions that are out there work as they currently exist, because those lotions are really just based off that one study essentially, and then whatever other like experience-based claims that the makers of the product have. And then the other potential downfall to this one study was that it was funded by a company that actually makes a sodium bicarbonate cream. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the study was biased, but it does introduce a potential source of bias into the study when you like objectively look at it. Whereas if it was just a bunch of researchers who had no relationship whatsoever to a company that makes sodium bicarbonate based lotions, then you would expect that the potential bias in that study would be a lot lower. Whereas when you have authors who are working for a company that makes sodium bicarbonate lotions that are participating in a research study that's looking at the outcomes of rubbing a sodium bicarbonate lotion on athletes, you would expect that those who are working for the company would want to see positive results. So just a potential source of bias that you have to be aware of as well. And the reason you kind of critique this study so heavily is because there is only that one study. If there was a lot of different studies and there was only a few of them that were biased like that, and most of the studies show that the creams or lotions worked, then you know that the one study with the little bit of potential bias and the small sample size might not be as big of a concern. So when it comes to the creams and the lotions, I would say approach these with caution, just because there, again, isn't ample research to necessarily say whether it works or not. And then the other thing when it comes to these lotions is they're incredibly expensive. So I, at one point, looked into like how much they would cost because I was interested. I was like, oh, you know, sodium bicarbonate. I know that that's a relatively well-studied performance-enhancing substance. And if you can get away with not ingesting it, then that might be really cool. Or that might be a really good way to get the sodium bicarbonate into your system. So I remember looking at it a while back, and I was like blown away with how expensive it is. It's like, I think it's like $50 or $60 for a bottle of this cream or lotion. So it's insanely expensive. And I'm just always cautious when it comes to supplements and products that don't have a ton of research to back them up, because they all tend to be so expensive. So it's not necessarily like that you would avoid something because it's going to be bad for you. It's more so avoid a product that's ridiculously expensive or that doesn't have a lot of research to back it up. If it's ridiculously expensive, because you don't necessarily know if it's going to work or not. So at least with products and supplements that are out there that have a lot of research to back them up, if they're expensive, you can at least fall back on the fact that it has a lot of research to back up the physiological claims and performance outcome claims that product or supplement might be making. So again, something to just be cautious of when looking at potentially buying a sodium bicarbonate based cream or lotion. Obviously, the cheapest way to get it into your system is probably just to consume it through baking soda. And then the next way to get it would be through some kind of supplement. But again, just to summarize, ingesting sodium bicarbonate and what some of the research suggests, even though the research suggests that it has a moderate effect on performance, again, across a variety of different individuals, across a variety of different sports, across men and women, it does tend to elicit some potential GI discomfort or distress. So just make sure that you experiment with it in training before you decide to use it on race day, because you wouldn't want to show up on race day and try it out and then have horrific GI distress that then keeps you from performing at your best. So that potential downside of the GI distress might outweigh some of the positives that it has on performance. And then again, you can get it through a cream or a lotion, but there's not a whole lot of research to back up the creams and lotions that are out there, and that they do work. One of the biggest things that I would question is making sure that the dose of sodium bicarbonate in the cream or lotion is enough elicit performance. And so these are just some things to be aware of when considering whether or not you want to try out sodium bicarbonate in your training or racing. So there you have it. There's a little bit of a dive into some of the research supporting the ingestion of sodium bicarbonate and its effects on athletic performance. And then again, we touched on the little bit of research that's been done when it comes to sodium bicarbonate-based creams and lotions, and some of the potential things to be wary of when it comes to ingesting sodium bicarbonate, and then also using it through a cream or a lotion. So hopefully you got something out of this podcast as it relates to sodium bicarbonate. If it's something that you always kind of had questions on and never really took the time to look into yourself, then hopefully this episode was useful for you in answering a lot of the questions that you might have had surrounding sodium bicarbonate and its benefits on athletic performance. Again, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it and got something useful out of it, whether you're an athlete yourself or a coach working with other athletes. And I hope you continue to listen to future episodes. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.